Over the years, the American Central Intelligence Agency has gained a reputation for being the most far-reaching, sophisticated, and effective government intelligence agency on the planet. At the same time, the CIA has also become known for its incredible paranoia and propensity to undertake costly, sometimes illegal, and often downright absurd projects in the name of gaining an edge on the competition. From spy cats to psychic hippies, the following are 10 of the weirdest spy programs the government has proposed and funded over the years. Number 10. Acoustic Kitty. Most people wouldn't think of the common house cat as a potential master of espionage, but the CIA certainly did. In the 1960s, American intelligence is said to have spent over $20 million on Acoustic Kitty, a top-secret project that used cats as recording devices. The project took a group of specially trained cats and surgically implanted microphones, antennae, and batteries into their tails, and then set them loose near the Russian embassy. The idea was that an unassuming cat would be able to stride right up to groups of communist officials and listen in on their conversation, which it could then beam back to agents with its sophisticated radio equipment. The plan was eventually put into action, but the first cat sent into the field was supposedly run over by a taxi before it could make a recording. With that, Operation Acoustic Kitty was abandoned. Number 9. Operation Mockingbird. One of the most ambitious and downright insidious programs ever launched by the CIA was Operation Mockingbird, a propaganda project that was implemented in the early 1950s. It was a massive undertaking that saw as many as 3,000 CIA agents and collaborators attempt to gain some control of the free press by feeding select groups of reporters information and using newspapers at home and abroad to filter the kinds of stories that got to the public. At its height, the program included writers for the New York Times, Newsweek, and Time magazine among its ranks, and was said to have a significant influence on as many as 25 major newspapers. The program had a major impact abroad as well, as it served a major function in helping to sway public opinion in the run-up to the eventual overthrowing of Guatemala's leftist president. Operation Mockingbird continued to have a major effect on worldwide media throughout the 1950s, and it was not until the 1960s that a series of reports by investigative journalists brought the program to light. Number 8. Operation Gold. One of the most audacious intelligence operations of the Cold War was 1953's Operation Gold, which was a joint effort between the CIA and Britain's MI6 to hack into the phone lines of Soviet headquarters in East Berlin. This required the construction of a massive 450-meter-long tunnel that would intersect with an underground telephone junction. Just preparing the tunnel took 6 months and involved a substantial amount of risk and subterfuge. But when it was done, the CIA proceeded to carefully record as many as 50,000 telephone conversations over the course of nearly a year. The problem? Well, a mole discovered the operation, told the KGB about it, and then the KGB fed information that was false to them the entire time. In 1956, the Soviets raided the tunnel and shut it down, and the operation eventually caused a great deal of controversy for the American and British intelligence communities. Number 7. Operation Northwoods. In the early 1960s, when the Cold War was in full swing and fear of communism was rampant, a plan dubbed Operation Northwoods was proposed within the American CIA. In short, it called for the government to perform a series of violent terrorist actions in US cities, including bombings, hijackings, phony riots, and sabotage, all of which could then be blamed on Cuba. This would drum up support for a war against the communists and lead to an eventual military operation to remove Fidel Castro from power. The plan was drafted and signed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and was presented to President John F. Kennedy, who personally rejected it, and it was subsequently abandoned. For years afterwards, Operation Northwoods existed as a rumor, but it was finally revealed to be true when top-secret documents describing the plan were made public in 1997 as part of a release of government papers relating to the Kennedy assassination. Number 6. Project Pigeon. One of the most seemingly preposterous military programs of all time occurred during World War II, when famed behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner was enlisted by the government to try and train pigeons for use in a missile guidance system. At the time, Skinner was known as one of the major practitioners of operant conditioning, a system that used reward and punishment as a means of controlling behavior. With these ideas in mind, Skinner placed a series of specially trained pigeons inside missiles. A camera on the front of the missile recorded its flight path, which was then projected onto a screen for the pigeon to see. The birds were then trained to recognize the missile's intended target, and they would peck at the screen if it was drifting off course. This information was fed to the weapon's flight controls, which would then be changed to reflect the new coordinates. Skinner was originally given $25,000 to get the project up and running, and he eventually managed to make some minor progress with it. However, government officials were never quite able to get past the obvious absurdity of the program, and it was eventually shut down. Number 5. Operation Midnight Climax. In the early 1960s, the youth culture of America was first beginning to experiment with hallucinogenic drugs like LSD, and so was the CIA. Operation Midnight Climax was one of the government's most ridiculous and illegal attempts to test the possible uses of drugs like acid by administering them to unsuspecting citizens. The program was run out of a collection of safe houses in New York and California. Prostitutes were used to lure young men to the houses, at which point they were given food or drinks that were spiked with LSD and other drugs, and they were placed in a room with a two-way mirror where their behavior could be observed. Midnight Climax was essentially an experimental program designed to monitor the possible tactical uses of psychotropic drugs and sexual blackmail in the field, but even within the agency it was controversial and it was shut down after only a few years. Most of the files connected to the operation were destroyed, but a few survived, and in the early 1970s the files regarding Midnight Climax and many other illegal CIA programs were brought to light in a famous story by the New York Times. Number 4. The Stargate Project. The $20 million Stargate Project was a blanket term used to describe a large number of psychic experiments and investigations undertaken by the US government between the 1970s and 1990s. The biggest goal of the Stargate Project was to investigate the scientific probability of remote viewing, which is the psychic ability to witness events over great distances. The program, which also investigated psychic abilities like out-of-body experiences and clairvoyance, tested subjects on their ability to predict future events and read hidden documents. The project often enlisted anywhere between 3 and 22 subjects at a time, many of whom managed to test with an accuracy rating as much as 15% higher than the norm. Still, although some participants claimed to have correctly predicted major world events like military attacks and hostage situations, the program found that remote viewers and so-called telepaths were still wrong nearly 80% of the time. In 1995, the CIA cancelled the Stargate Project for good. Number 3. Operation Mongoose. In the early 60s, Communist Cuba became one of the major battlegrounds of the Cold War, and its president Fidel Castro came to be considered one of the most dangerous political figures in the world. After early attempts to overthrow Castro by force failed, the CIA instituted Operation Mongoose, which was a secret war of propaganda and sabotage designed to remove the Cuban leader from power. Operation Mongoose had a remarkably wide scope and included plans to fake attacks on Cuban exiles, provide arms to opposition groups, and destroy Cuba's crop of sugarcane. It also included several attempts to either assassinate or discredit Castro in the press, each of which was more elaborate and ridiculous than the next. The agency considered, among other things, poisoning Castro's personal supply of cigars, planting explosive devices disguised as seashells in his favorite swimming spots, and injecting him with a deadly chemical from a hypodermic needle disguised as a pen. Even more bizarre were the plans to discredit Castro in the public eye, which included a proposal to spray a TV studio with hallucinogens prior to one of the leader's televised speeches, and even planting chemicals in his clothes that would cause his famous beard to fall out. The near disaster of the Cuban Missile Crisis put Operation Mongoose on hold, and following an agreement between Kennedy and the Soviets, it was more or less abandoned. Number 2. Project MKULTRA. One of the most downright creepy government programs and the fodder of countless conspiracy theories, Project MKUltra was a sweeping and top-secret CIA program that started in the early 1950s that included experiments in chemical interrogation and mind control. In short, MKUltra was a plan that sought to use drugs, psychological stress, and bizarre interrogation methods to get information, control behavior, and even alter brain function. To this day, much of the information on the project remains classified, but what we do know is that the program involved the testing and interrogation of private citizens, often without their knowledge or consent. The idea here was to discover whether or not certain drugs could be used as truth serums. This included giving subjects large doses of LSD, amphetamine, and mescaline, as well as using shock therapy. In one case, subjects were supposedly exposed to acid for 77 days in an attempt to test the effects of long-term exposure to the drug. Conspiracy theories abound about the real goals of the project, with some saying it was a program to engineer zombie assassins through mind control and brainwashing. Some information about MKUltra was finally brought to light in the early 70s when news reports about CIA abuses of power led to a congressional commission. The project was subsequently shut down, but many people claim that similar CIA programs exist to this very day. Number 1. The Bay of Pigs invasion. For sheer absurdity, wastefulness, and infamy, few CIA projects compare to 1961's failed Bay of Pigs invasion. The program was one of the first and boldest attempts to overthrow communist Cuban leader Fidel Castro, but it was also the most disastrously unsuccessful. It started in 1960 when the CIA, under the authorization of the president, began planning an attempted overthrow of the Cuban government. In order to eliminate any link to the US, the attack was to be perpetrated by an army of Cuban exiles specifically trained by the CIA. After a series of diversionary airstrikes, on April 17, 1961, a group of amphibious troop transports landed on a beach in the Bay of Pigs and began unloading their cargo of 1,300 exile guerrillas. The plan was for them to rendezvous with a smaller band of paratroops to be dropped soon after their arrival, but from the beginning their plan was tragically mistimed. For starters, Cuban intelligence was already aware of the planned invasion, and this meant that when the exile troops landed, they were almost immediately under attack. To add to the force's problems, bad weather, coral reefs, and the Cuban swamps quickly claimed most of their equipment. All told, an estimated 2,000 Cubans died during the invasion, while over 100 members of the exile army were killed in action. The remaining 1,200 were captured and imprisoned, and some were later executed on the orders of Castro. Over a year later, the rest were freed in exchange for $53 million in food and medicine for the Cuban people. The effects of the Bay of Pigs were far-reaching. Several American officials resigned over their involvement in it, and many have credited it with increasing the resolve of the Cuban government and encouraging a severe distrust of American foreign policy in the years that followed. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do give us a thumbs up below, and don't forget to subscribe. We've got brand new videos just like this every day of the week. If you want more from me, why not check out my other channel called Biographics? You will find that linked to below. And as always, thank you for watching.